Our next speaker is Angela Thomas, who's a pediatric hematologist, vice chair for the Commission for Human Medicines in the UK and chair of their Clinical Trials, Biological and Vaccines Expert Advisory Group.
Well, I'd like to thank the organisers very much for inviting me to this workshop, and I'm sorry that I wasn't here yesterday, and just to say I have no interest to declare. As you've heard, biological therapies, and that includes advanced therapeutic medicinal products, are proving very useful in the area of cancer treatment. They're complex medicines, and they have an inherent variability, and actually manufacture is difficult and expensive. In the cancer arena, they have been shown to be proving their worth, but there are significant uncertainties both in the efficacy and the safety of some of these medicines, not least because the population in which they're being used is often small and the therapies are targeted. There are no adequate, really preclinical models to predict what's going to happen. So what I'm going to do now is outline some of the strategies, both pre and post licensing, from both a UK and a European perspective, to show how we may get some of these medicines into the clinic in a timely and safe fashion. So European pharmaceutical law allows a single market in pharmaceuticals, and the idea is that there's an equal chance for every citizen to benefit. But in fact, each individual nation can determine whether that the license that's given throughout the European Union is not synonymous with whether it will be marketed in the individual nations. And even if it is marketed, there's no guarantee that it will be used. And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of technical assessment later. I do hope I can go forward. Sorry. I'll try. Okay. Yep.
So just hold the device because it's...
Oh, okay, thanks. So the EU is 28 countries and 3 from the EEA, and is about half the landmass of America, but has about 1.5 the population of the US. So for European licensing procedures, there are 3 main procedures: a centralized procedure, where there's a single application and evaluation, and if the drug is authorized, it's in all EU member states together with the same product packaging and the same information for the product, and the European Commission grants the license. Mutual recognition is where it's authorized in one EU member state, and then the company can apply for authorization in further EU states. And the decentralized procedure, the application occurs in several states simultaneously, and the company can determine which of these methods it uses. Except there are certain mandatory centralized procedures, and these are for biotechnology product, orphan drugs, and cancer. So on this count, really all the drugs that we're talking about in this workshop today will have to go through the centralized procedure. Within the EMA, or the European Medicines Agency, countries bid to be the main assessors, which is called the rapporteur and co-rapporteur, and they're appointed by the Committee on Medicinal Products for Human Use, which is a CHMP. The whole procedure is administered by the European Medicines Agency. The RAP and co-RAP look at the full dossier and produce reports of their own. The member states who are not RAP and co-RAP can look at partially at some of the data and give voluntary comments. And then the license will be granted on the basis of quality, safety, and efficacy, but cost is not an issue. Biological products, including biosimilars, as has already been alluded to in the earlier talk, have an evolving set of licensing guidelines, which can sometimes be quite difficult to work through. And so from a manufacturer's point of view, applying for a license, it can be extremely helpful to have early talks with the advisors at the EMA. Now, the growth of biologicals, it's 27% of pharmaceutical sales in Europe in 2014, and they're showing a 5.5% growth versus a total market growth of 1.9%. Now, importantly, many patents are due to expire before 2020, which allows the development of biosimilar medicines. As you know, there's an inherent variability in biological medicines, so making a biosimilar, there's another whole complexity on how variable they're likely to be and how similar is similar. And there's a lot of guidance coming out in Europe about that. The important thing to remember with a biosimilar, it is not innovative. It is based on an authorized biological. And one thing is there will be extensive knowledge gained with the originator, so that will actually concentrate or compact the studies and so on that are needed to get the biosimilar on the market. And because of that, there'll be potential for decreased cost and increased availability. Now, that's already being seen with drugs such as rituximab and trastuzumab. In the EU, the patent for rituximab expired in February 2013 and is due to expire in September this year in the US. There are already some biosimilars on the market in certain countries. For instance, in Iran, a biosimilar was licensed in 2015, and in Russia in 2014. However, the processes in those countries for biosimilars is very different from the US and the EU, and they're not allowed to be marketed in the ES and the EU, but they are in development. Rituximab, the sales of rituximab were nearly £6 billion in 2014, and for trastuzumab were nearly £7 billion in 2013. So if you can get a biosimilar on the market, there is potential, as I've said, to reduce cost. So for trastuzumab, the patent expired in the EU in July 2014 and will expire in June 2019 in the US. And again, there are already biosimilars out there. Celltrion has made Herzuma, which is licensed in Korea, and they're probably leading the development of a biosimilar trastuzumab for the US and EU market. So biosimilar medicines is one way of increasing availability and decreasing costs of these complex immunotherapies. So in the EMA, there's the idea now of early on designating a medicine a promising innovative medicine. Biosimilars are not innovative, but there are plenty of innovative therapies coming online. And they must meet certain criteria in that they must be life-threatening or seriously debilitating conditions with a high unmet clinical need and a major advantage over other methods. And I think you've seen probably from preliminary data that in cancer, particularly in patients who've multiply relapsed, there is a high unmet clinical need, and often the results with these new immunotherapies are quite spectacular compared with conventional therapy. The PIM designation is awarded on phase 1 and 2 data, so it's awarded comparatively early, but with the expectation that it will develop a clinical program in phase 3 trials. And in the UK, this can be through the Early Access to Medicine scheme, or the EAMS scheme, which I'll explain now. So for Early Access to Medicine scheme, it really helps to bridge the gap between the results from the clinical trials, the phase 3 clinical trials, and the licensing, where there is always a gap in time before the medicine is available. So the supply of the product must be made to GMP standards, but the safety profile is usually not fully established. It's important that patients who are given these medicines know that, and they are told about that. There's information, and they have to sign a consent form. For the prescribing oncologist, they must contact the company that makes the drug with the ICF form and an application form, and the patient will be registered, will be put on a registry. In NHS England, they will supply the unique number, but in Wales and Scotland, the number will be supplied by the company. The oncologist then will fill in a form for drug supply and a case report form, and may request the drug for 2 cycles. Now, at this point, it's not licensed, although there are quite a lot of data available, and the drug company will provide the drug free of charge. So it's important, one of the most important things, though, is to collect the data on use of the medicines under this setting, and there's specific training on adverse event reporting for the physicians, and they have to sign a letter of agreement saying that they will actually collect those data. The patient will be given a clinical alert card as well as be on a registry, and there's a very tight pharmacovigilance and risk management plan. So it's getting data to help support licensing and ensuring that patients have access to a medicine during that interim period. We have seen with the EAMS scheme recurrent applications with the same drug. For instance, pembrolizumab and nivolumab have both come through the EAMS scheme with a first indication as more safety data has been accrued. It's come through for a second indication and even a third for some of them. The safety data can be pooled, and in this way you can get a lot of information about these immunotherapies in a very controlled and careful way. There was concern that they may impair recruitment to trials, but that hasn't really been seen. These usually are only allowed after phase 3 trials, although some of the trials are completing. The other concern is that it may be inequitable across the country, with the company being keener to supply the drug to certain centres than others. So those are unlicensed medicines. The EMA has a scheme, or several schemes for early licensing, and one of them is adaptive licensing, and it allows early and progressive access to new drugs. Again, the quality and non-clinical data is sound, but often at the phase, just after the phase 1 study and in the pre-phase 2 or during phase 2, early discussions on development take place between the EMA, the company, health technology assessment bodies, organisations issuing clinical treatment guidelines, and patient organisations, and it's done in what's called a safe harbour environment, so that there's free discussion, no commitment, but ethical considerations, I was going to say retribution, reimbursement can be discussed, how the trials will be designed, and so on. And this is done early in the drug's development. So with adaptive licensing, the license may be granted rather earlier than normal, and there may be incomplete safety and efficacy data. So it will initially start in a restricted patient population, which as data are accrued, which will then expand. And it's really the moment the drug is licensed, it's used in real life. The data must be carefully controlled and monitored, will supplement clinical trial data, but importantly, this will not be randomized. But it is proving a useful way of getting drugs out into the patient population earlier. So I did mention earlier that once the drug is licensed, it's not necessarily used, and that's the role of health technology assessments. And in England, it's called NICE, National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, and it guides the use of treatments in the NHS and has to consider clinical and cost effectiveness. It does not look specifically at benefit risk. It considers all therapies, and cancer therapy is not prioritised. There are 4 types of guidance, but for cancer therapy, it's the technical assessment that's important. So this is a multidisciplinary field of policy analysis taking account of social, medical, ethical considerations. And in England, it's NICE, which has really become synonymous with the HTA in the UK. But in Scotland, there's a Scottish Medicines Consortium, and Wales has its own group as well. They work in slightly different ways, but I will concentrate on NICE as the most has been written about it. Not all drugs are appraised through the NICE technology program, and in fact, not all cancer drugs. If the drug is in a very rare disease, it often will not have been appraised. So the burden of disease is taken into consideration, population morbidity and mortality, and the resource impact of that drug for introduction into the NHS. It needs to conform with government priorities. They obviously supply the money, and therefore they have priorities, and that helps determine whether the drug will be appraised. And the idea is that it will even out inappropriate variations in practice. The idea, too, is that the guidelines are got out in a timely fashion so that they can actually give a real-time help, and they must have a predicted impact on public health and quality of life and reduce health inequalities. So there's an independent technology assessment group, which is often an academic body, which looks at the manufacturer's submission done on a template to try and standardize things, and prepares a technology assessment report for the Technology Appraisal Committee. And you can see there that there are a lot of interested stakeholders are part of that committee, as well as all other organizations, which, such as the manufacturer itself or patient advocacy groups and so on, that can submit evidence. It has methodological rigor, and its activities are comparatively transparent. There are 2 types of assessment. The MTA, which has a very broad consultation but takes 54 weeks, and then the single technology appraisal, which is streamlined and really just involves the manufacturer's submission and consultee bodies' opinions. And it's mainly cancer drugs, and the timeline can be as brief as 39 weeks, but it can again be delayed if there are appeals against the decision. So there's a standardization of submission. The drug itself must be licensed. And in terms of the way it's working at the moment, if it's less than £20,000 or $30,000 per quality adjusted life year, it's likely to be recommended. If it's more than 30,000, it's unlikely to be recommended. But if it's there's a life expectancy of about 2 years and the drug will prolong a person's life for more than 3 months, the quality adjusted life year is weighted so that in fact it's probably around 50,000 per QALY that's allowed for recommendation after the HTA. Once NICE has made its recommendation, the NHS is obliged to follow their advice, but unfortunately that happens in an uneven way. There's criticism of NICE because there's lack of independence from the government, but the government does set the budget and it has its own priorities, and actually the remit of NICE is to have be cost resource efficient. One of the big criticisms, however, is the time taken for assessment. So in 2011, the Cancer Drugs Fund was implemented, £200 million per year, but rising now to £340 million per year. This is just in England for cancer drugs which may have been rejected by NICE, which may not have been submitted for assessment, in which the technical assessment may not be complete or may not have even been chosen for appraisal. And although this gave access to patient populations to drugs that were not accessible through the NICE appraisal system, the costs have increased, and it actually has drawn money away from drugs which have shown their clinical and cost effectiveness. And probably most importantly, data on drug use and outcome has not been collected. And this was really a poor use of money in terms of knowing how the drugs are performing. The Cancer Fund was not designed to reduce uncertainties, and in some cases, because the appraisal had been bypassed, costs of the therapy has been driven up. The use of the money was determined by regional committees, and therefore there was uneven access to drugs across the country. And because of that, it's being discontinued on the 31st of March this year, so within a month. And a new transitional fund is being introduced in April 2016, which hopefully takes the best of NICE and also the accessibility of the Cancer Drugs Fund. So NHS England will hold the budget and NICE will make the recommendations. And the last slide, I'll just briefly say how it will work. So rather than selecting most drugs, it will do all cancer drugs, and significant new indications will be assessed. There'll be clear entry and exit criteria for use of the fund. NICE will liaise closely with the EMA to find out which therapies are likely to be licensed, and 90 days before the proposed marketing authorization date, they will do a preliminary guideline and will either recommend routine use, not recommend routine use, or conditional recommendation within the Cancer Drugs Fund. And so at the point of licensing, the Cancer Drugs Fund will fund that drug for routine use until it comes mainstream into the NHS, or there'll be the conditional recommendation, which will be limited by time, the use of the fund. So for instance, if the population of patients taking the drug are likely to produce the data that will then confirm the efficacy and safety, that time will be enshrined in the agreement. An acceptable commercial access agreement will also be required so that the costs are not too high, and the data that must be collected are also agreed. And so this will be a much better use of the Cancer Fund. If at the end of it the decision is positive, the drug will be funded through the routine NHS, and if not, it will be withdrawn from the Cancer Drugs Fund and will not go any further and can be applied just on an individual patient basis. So in summary, bringing immunotherapy to patients, there's biosimilar medicine development, the promising innovative medicine scheme, early access to medicine and adaptive licensing, and then the new way that NICE will be working with the Cancer Drugs Fund. Thank you.